Good evening. Welcome to Live United. Live United is an opportunity and a chance to hear about all the great things happening in the Monadnock region that make a difference in the lives of our citizens. Today, I'm joined by Phil Huber. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
Phil's joining us from Granite State Children's Alliance, and many of you may not have heard of this program yet, but an incredibly valuable service that is now here in the Monadnock region and has actually been here as a service, I think, for a while, but not in the same form that it's currently in. So Phil, tell us a little bit, what is Granite State Children's Alliance?
So the Children's Alliance is a statewide organization that operates child advocacy centers in every county in New Hampshire. We have a child advocacy center here in Keene, also Peterborough. We also operate child advocacy centers in Nashua, Manchester, and Laconia. Let me tell you about the function of an advocacy center. These centers are locations that are child and family friendly, and they're a location where we conduct the forensic interview of suspected child abuse victims. So this interview essentially puts a child on the first step towards a healing process. Now, there's a couple of shocking and very disturbing statistics about child abuse and child sexual abuse. Would you believe that 1 in 4 girls in the country are sexually abused by the time of age 18? The statistics for boys is 1 in 6. So we know that child abuse is horrible. It's even more horrible because it's so prevalent. And the other side of the coin that is particularly shocking as well is that only about 1 in 10 child abuse victims comes forward and reports their abuse. So it tends to be a suppressed issue that is sometimes bottled up inside a kid well into adulthood. So when a suspected abuse is reported to either the Division for Child, Youth, and Families, DCYF, or to law enforcement, those agencies immediately contact the Child Advocacy Center. We then immediately put together a team, an appropriate team. It's called a multidisciplinary team. These are professionals who will essentially coordinate and oversee the investigation of the child abuse. So this team would include law enforcement, the county attorney's office, child victim services, child victim advocates. It would include DCYF. It would include, here in our region, the Monadnock Center for Violence Prevention, and it could include mental and medical health services as well. And so this multidisciplinary team exists essentially to oversee the investigation of the child abuse, to also witness the forensic interview that's conducted by our staff. This team also exists to provide the family and child the services and help that they need to put them on a path to healing after the abuse has been reported. In most cases, the forensic interview can lead to the arrest of the suspected perpetrator, and also in the vast majority of cases, these prosecutions, arrests, and convictions are made outside of the court. The forensic interview becomes such compelling evidence that there's motivation to basically settle these cases. And that's saving the community a considerable amount of money to avoid trials. So in very simple terms, what is our role? Our role is to help lock up persons who have committed, frankly, despicable acts. That's the one side of it. The other side is we help families and children heal from this abuse.
Wow, an important role out in the community. And I know you mentioned that 1 in 4 children are abused. And I think oftentimes, for females, and 1 in 6 for males. And I think oftentimes we think, well, that can't be happening here. You know, we're in nice, scenic New Hampshire, and I think lots of times people don't realize what those statistics may be in their very own backyard. And I know you have cases here. We're not immune to it. We're like anywhere else in the country. These things do happen, and it is unfortunate. But we're fortunate to have this healing process available to people. But I'm sure our audience is saying, is it really here? Is it really here in the Monadnock region? So, you know, tell us about that.
So Kelly, you know some of the police officers here in Keene?
I do.
Ask them. You know the folks that work at DCYF? They see these cases every day. Ask any teacher. Ask any guidance counselor. Child sexual abuse is prevalent, and the statistics are real. And you have to also recognize that if you are suspicious or have suspicions that a child is being abused, we are actually obligated as citizens to report that abuse. And believe it or not, at our Child Advocacy Center here in Keene, we average 3 forensic interviews per week. That's 150 cases a year in Keene. I mean, that's just a shocking number. And also recognize that of those 3 per week, that's only 1 in 10 that are being reported. Only 1 in 10 children come forward with the suspected abuse.
So you mentioned that we as citizens have a responsibility around this, and I'm aware of the laws attached to that, but I bet a lot of people don't know that, and maybe don't know what to do if they do suspect something. You read, oftentimes you pick up the newspaper, for example, and you may read, well, you know, I thought maybe something was going on and you're a neighbor, but, you know, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get involved. If somebody feels like something is going on, what's their best recourse? Who do they reach out to? Do they call the local police department?
They can call either the local police or DCYF. Either entity can handle it. I actually learned of that obligation when I worked for Big Brothers Big Sisters, because in one of our intake interviews, interviewing one of our children, we learned about significant violence in the home, and we took immediate action, and the police actually went into the home the next morning after this intake interview and diffused a really difficult situation right on the spot. So it's an important obligation that we have as citizens. Hopefully, frankly, none of us ever do suspect child abuse, but you know darn well that teachers see it.
And I know teachers report when they're saying these things because they are under that obligation. But I think we as neighbors, neighbor to neighbor, if we're suspecting something, you can call the Division of Children, Youth, and Families. They're located right here in Keene. There's an office. You can also call 211.
That's right.
Absolutely call 211 to report these kinds of things, and they'll direct you to the right organization to call.
So DCYF, by the way, they don't want you to visit them if you suspect. They want you to phone. Mm-hmm. That's the process that they have.
So I would say, because we don't have the DCYF phone numbers to go up on the screen, that I would encourage you, audience, if you do feel like you need to reach out to somebody regarding these kinds of incidents, that you call 211 and get a referral to either the local police department or to the Division of Children, Youth, and Families. So somebody refers a person in, or they've been identified, and they come to you. You're meeting with the family and the child?
Yes. We schedule the forensic interview to be held in our Child Advocacy Center. And the interview is comprised, the forensic interview is a one-on-one interview of the child. The term of the guardian who attends as well is called the non-offending guardian. So it could be the mother, it could be the grandmother, it could be an aunt. The term is non-offending guardian. And when they come into our center, the first step in the process is the non-offending guardian meets with the multidisciplinary team and has explained the whole process of what's going to occur, and the fact that the forensic interview is highly confidential. It's done in a child-friendly office space, one-on-one with our expert forensic interviewer. That interview is actually recorded by closed-circuit TV and fed into the multidisciplinary team. That team can also communicate with the forensic interview by an earpiece, so that if there is a certain direction that they'd like the interview to go, that information can be fed into the forensic interviewer. Recognize that this interview is witnessed by the county attorney, law enforcement, the child victim advocates, the Monadnock Center for Violence Protection, and DCYF. They are there to ensure that the abuse that has been reported is credible and prosecutorial.
I think I really want to highlight a word in here that you've used, which is advocacy. And I think, we're inundated with the messages from TV about the prosecution end of things, and that's a piece of what is provided here. But you're serving as an advocate for these children, an advocate in terms of their safety, an advocate in terms of their healing, all of these things. So can you talk about really how Granite State Children's Alliance is the advocate for these children and for the family?
Well, that's absolutely right. Recognize half of our work is conducting the forensic interview. The other half of our work is making sure that there are coordinated services that help the children heal. And, children are very resilient. With the right support system, they can recover from this and ultimately lead a happy and productive life. But if they're not advocated for, or if they don't come forward with their abuse, there tends to be what we call a cycle of abuse, much like cycle of poverty or cycle of incarceration. Abusers don't make this stuff up. The abusers tend to have been abused themselves. And it's vitally important that we coordinate through DCYF, through the Monadnock Center for Violence Protection, through our own community outreach programs and services, that we advocate for these kids, because they can heal.
And I think that's a really important message, because again, that's about if you are part of, you have some kind of knowledge or you suspect something, take action on it, because we have to remember these are our children. And it's only us that can be the advocates for them. They don't always have the ability to be their own advocates, especially if they're living in any kind of fear. So it's extremely important. And, again, I want to highlight that we see case after case where somebody thought maybe something was going on, but just didn't report it and take the time to do that. And I think people fear doing that. They fear getting involved. And that's why I wanted to highlight the word advocacy, because we're all advocates.
That's right. And see, the other side of advocacy, a lot of the forensic interview is much like peeling an onion. And as you peel it and you get closer to the truth, we're not going to get into graphic details on a television program. But these abuses, they can basically go beyond your imagination. I mean, it's just absolutely horrific what these people, and sometimes their fathers or uncles or grandfathers, what they're doing to these little girls. I mean, it's disturbing, it's shocking, but we've got to get involved so that we can break that cycle and help these kids heal.
And you mentioned that for them, sometimes it becomes a cycle of abuse, and they become abusers at some point in their life, potentially. So it becomes even more critical at this early age to be able to intervene and be able to help them get to a place where they don't continue that cycle later in their lives. So important work that you're doing. Now, Granite State Children's Alliance is a statewide, you mentioned that, serving multiple areas across the state. Really want to focus on the Monadnock region and what you're doing here. Because again, I think people sometimes forget that it can be right in our own backyard. You're collaborating with lots of organizations here. People may be wondering, why a Keene office? Why not, why aren't we sending people over to Laconia?
Well, it's important that we have a center locally, for sure. The other side is when the Monadnock Region Child Advocacy Center was first founded in 2007, it operated under the umbrella of Monadnock Family Services. And I'm actually not aware of the history of why it became independent from MFS, but the way the Child Advocacy Center was staffed, it was very difficult for us to essentially do community outreach, do our own internal fundraising. So that's essentially how it became part of the statewide organization, because we weren't financially self-sustainable here in the region. Part of my new job is to fix that problem. We're actually hiring a full-time forensic interviewer solely dedicated to the Monadnock region. And that's going to essentially free my time to conduct community outreach. Recognize that we're very well known by law enforcement. We're very well known by DCYF. We're very well known by the county attorneys. And the defense attorneys, of course, know us as well. But the community doesn't know about us. I mean, let's face it, child abuse is not a topic for a dinner table conversation. It's the worst part of us, and it's difficult for us to confront that. But I will say that one of our community outreach efforts is we are conducting a reception in May at Allison's Orchard that's being hosted by John and Jean Hoffman, and it's a free evening event, and it's intended to showcase to the community the really great work that we do and to try to raise our profile as an agency. And it is probably also surprising, given that we're a 501c3 corporation that is a child-serving agency. This is the first year that we're applying for Monadnock United Way funding. And it's simply because we haven't had the development resources.
And it sounds like you're really trying to grow the presence of the Alliance here and the Child Advocacy Center here in the Monadnock region, that there's a need for it. Sounds like there's a need for it anywhere in the state and the country, honestly, and that's the sad part of it. But the great part of it is that we can be proactive in really getting in with these kids at a much younger age, or before they head into their young adulthood and become parents potentially themselves or move into our workforce. Because I believe you deal with quite an age range as well.
Our age range is from 4 to 18. And occasionally there are adults that come forward as well. And the other side to think about is that by far the most effective way to reduce or prevent child abuse is to educate the community on the prevalence of child abuse in our community, in fact in every community, and then also to educate the community on the ramifications of child abuse, what that really means. What does that mean to the victim? What does that mean to the family? What does that mean if the victim doesn't come forward and bottles it up for years? Imagine.
And these are hard conversations. I know Monadnock Center for Violence Prevention has a whole program on child sexual abuse, for example, and that is for parents and really a preventative program. And I know it's challenging to actually get parents to come in and want to talk about this. And that's what I mean when I say it's a hard conversation to have. You mentioned it's the sort of evil side of things, and I think lots of times people don't want to confront that.
Kelly, it's hard for everyone involved. Mm-hmm. Not so much with the experts who are trained in how to deal with this. But I see the families come into our center. You know, that's a hard step to make. It's hard to open the door. It's hard to admit that this is occurring in your family. It's hard to admit that this is happening to your child. It's hard to admit that the abuser might be your spouse. Imagine. So it's about as stressful a situation as you can imagine. But when the forensic interview is done properly, the child can relax and be open. It's amazing what kids are willing to share when they're properly prompted. It's amazing how truthful they can become. It's also amazing how when the family realizes if there is a serious abuse that's occurring, there's a law enforcement process that will fix at least part of that. And, you know, honestly, these abusers, they need to be locked up, for sure.
Sounds like you're quite passionate about your new role here, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with you from your role with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and you've moved over into this area. And, you know, why is it so important? Like, why is it so important to you? Why are you so passionate about this now?
Well, I think that if you think about a higher purpose, I mean, what could be better than being part of a process that prosecutes people that need to be prosecuted and helps a family heal? You know, these children are by far the most vulnerable kids in our community. They're vulnerable. They tend to come from, in many cases, dysfunctional families or homes. They can turn their lives around. When you get the Monadnock Center for Violence Prevention involved, you get DCYF involved, you get MFS involved, you get Cheshire Medical Center involved. We provide the community outreach and education within the community. We can break the cycle of child abuse and help these kids heal.
I really want to underscore that we. You know, and I keep saying this, but the we is all of us here in the Monadnock region, that we have this incredible resource available to us to really utilize and to be a partner with. And you require that. You require that we as citizens be active participants in this process if we're really going to change this situation. And it sounds like one we need to. It sounds like there's a call to action. I hear you saying there's a call to action for us to be responsible around this and to really, as citizens, report when we know or suspect something, to reach out and not be afraid to do that. Is there a way, how would you, if you were a citizen, and you are a citizen, I'm a citizen, what would you say you'd want to be looking for? And what would cause you to want to say, wow, maybe I need to reach out to someone right now?
Well, you know, if you're friends of a family and you've known a child for a while and the child's behavior significantly changes, so for example, maybe there's no more eye contact, or you get the sense that they're feeling very defensive. The case that we reported from Big Brothers Big Sisters last year, that's exactly what occurred, is that this child was just extremely defensive. And in our intake process, we were able to determine that there was violence in the home. And we immediately took action and diffused that situation. And that's why the community outreach and education component of what we do at the Child Advocacy Center, why that's so important, is that so we, you and I, citizens, understand that child abuse is prevalent in every community in the United States. It's not just poor communities, it's every community. And when we understand the ramifications of child abuse and we understand our responsibilities as citizens, making that call to report the abuse, that's an easy call to make.
And, you know, it's interesting because I used to facilitate a group with young women who had been abused. And I can remember that it was oftentimes a family member, and I think in a lot of cases it's someone they generally know. who has abused them. And that sometimes the women would or come forward, these were young girls, they'd come forward, and really because they trust an adult, most kids find an adult that they trust somewhere, and they're going to share information. And I think it's important for those adults to remember you then have that responsibility, if they've shared that information, to really do something with it, and to do something that is really going to allow action to be taken so that it doesn't continue. I can remember one of the young women saying to me that she told her parents, and they didn't believe her because it was her uncle. But they went and talked to the uncle. Instead of taking action, they wanted to talk to the uncle. And he abused her again. And then when she reported, they finally had to call in law enforcement in that situation. But they waited because it was a family member, because they were afraid to bring law enforcement into it, and they thought they could take care of it themselves. And I think we have to remember that law enforcement serves a purpose. Child advocacy centers serve a purpose. And even though this may be a really difficult topic and issue for people to want to talk about, it is critical because it could happen again.
Well, first of all, that's very common, that families are reluctant to report. It's also, in the vast majority of child abuse cases, the perpetrator is someone that the child knows and trusts, invariably a family member. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, there was a case that we dealt with a couple weeks ago that it was a father sexually abusing his 7-year-old. It's amazing to think about. But there is sort of a natural kind of a protection that occurs in a family. They think that they can sort of, deal with it themselves. They don't want to have police coming in the house. They think that they can solve it. Very difficult to solve without outside help. But the important thing for your viewers is that it is 90% of child abuse victims know the person who's committing the abuse, and they trust him. And oftentimes what makes coming forward so difficult is that the abuser will oftentimes threaten the child that if you report this, you're going to get in serious trouble.
So knowing all that and having this resource available to us now, what is your advice to people out there? What do you really want them to know from an educational standpoint, really understanding what the issue is and what they can do? And again, reaching out, being able to reach out to law enforcement or 211. But what is your message to people?
So the message is several steps. First, recognize that child abuse is prevalent in every community in the United States. It's all over the place. Recognize that children can heal if they come forward, and the proper team of support professionals is provided to the child and to their family. Recognize also that through preventive education and awareness, that child abuse can in fact be prevented simply by community awareness. And then finally recognize that we've simply got to report these abuses. These kids need help, and they can heal. And without professional help, that's not going to happen. And they are likely going to have very troubled adult lives if they don't heal from child abuse.
And we have to remember that those troubled adult lives they can become an abuser, but what's the impact on them in terms of their social life, their relationships in their future, their ability to work and get along with people. And you know, I oftentimes think about the post-traumatic stress disorder and what we're seeing with that. And we see that a lot with abuse cases now. So the long-term mental health issues, which oftentimes coincide then with substance abuse. So we've created potentially a whole cycle, unless we break it early on, for this person's life that isn't going to allow them to succeed in life. And so just such important work. I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. It's a hard topic for us to talk about. It's hard to hear that this goes on in our backyard or maybe at our neighbor's house. But it is one that we have to take action on as citizens here in the Monadnock region and as citizens of our country as well. You know, I think we oftentimes are looking at the global situations with the abuses that take place globally, and we sometimes forget what is happening right here in our own country and with our own children. And we each have a responsibility for that. So important work. Any last things you want the public to know about Granite State Children's Alliance, this new Children's Advocacy Center? Sounds like you're trying to build some financial support for the Advocacy Center here. I know you've come to the United Way, but are you doing any fundraisers? Do you have any upcoming events that you would want people participating in to support the center?
Well, that's a great question, Kelly. So for sure, we want to raise the awareness in the Monadnock region of the incredible work that we do. And we certainly will be seeking stronger financial support in our community. Recognize in some of our other communities where we have advocacy centers, particularly in Hillsborough County, the degree of financial support is really unbelievable. Our gala auction fundraiser, to be held next month, will be attended by 300 people. It's a black tie event, and it's one of the largest fundraisers in the state of New Hampshire. We'll be raising over $200,000 for the Child Advocacy Center in Hillsborough County. The New Hampshire Fisher Cats Foundation, their president is on our board of directors, and the foundation is organizing their own golf tournament for the Child Advocacy Center. In its first year, it raised $50,000. And so we know that the community support is there, and that's why we've applied for funding from the United Way for the first time. We're holding a reception in May at Allison's, hosted by John and Jean Hoffman. The purpose is that will be our first step to raise community awareness, and certainly ultimately down the road to give us the foundation to ask for community financial support. Recognize that also we receive funding. We're a public-private agency. We receive funding from Cheshire County, the state of New Hampshire, and the federal government. The federal funds come from an acronym called VOCA, which is the Victim of Crimes Act, and those monies come to us through the first the U.S. Department of Justice and then the State Attorney General's office, and those funds are used to essentially support our child advocacy centers. We're very strongly supported by all 5 of our top elected officials, both United States senators, both United States representatives, and Governor Hassan. And in fact, Kelly Ayotte, Senator Ayotte, will be attending our gala next month. So we're fortunate that we have this strong public-private partnership, but recognize that the private financing is very important to us as well.
So I hear that, and I would guess the viewers are saying, well, yeah, but why do we need local dollars for that? You know, why? And of course, United Way dollars stay local here in the Monadnock region. You know, here's Granite State Children's Alliance, a statewide agency. So they're probably saying, well, they've got state funding, they've got federal funding, they've got county funding. why do they need local funding? And why do you need local funding?
So well, that's a good question. I mean, you could certainly draw a pretty strong argument that our agency should be 100% funded by federal and state and local government, but that's just not the reality. Those funds cover about 20% of our operating costs. And the reason that we seek local funding is we have a child advocacy center right here in Keene. It's beautiful. It's welcoming to children. It's welcoming to their families. It enables our multidisciplinary team to witness a critically important interview that will lead to the prosecution or possible prosecution of an abuser. And without the center here in Keene, I mean, here's how these interviews were done in the past. The kid might be put in the back of a police car. Imagine that. Or the child might be interviewed by an officer in their home. Then they might be interviewed by DCYF in a different spot. Then they might be interviewed by MFS in a different spot. So through multiple interviews, you also can get inconsistent stories. So it's really important that the forensic interview be held in a child and family friendly place, and in a place that our multidisciplinary team can take the necessary steps after the interview to both prosecute the abuser and help the family and the child heal. So that's why it's important that we be here.
So as people may attend the Allison's Orchard event, will those dollars that are raised locally, and we know the dollars raised locally through the United Way will remain here in the Monadnock region, but will the other dollars raised here in the Monadnock region be utilized for the Keene location?
I mean, we're dedicating a full-time forensic interviewer to the Child Advocacy Center here in Keene. We have significant occupancy costs. The facility is, I mean, it's not a huge space, but we have to have a nice living room. We have to have a nice conference room. We've got to have an interview room and some administrative space. So the center has local expenses, both payroll and occupancy, and of course insurance. So yes, the dollars will stay here locally.
And I think that's important for you to know, viewers, because I think oftentimes, again, we feel like maybe we don't need to give because, you're receiving federal funding or you're receiving state funding, or, it gets back to what is our responsibility. So there's really two ways you can give to this particular program. You can give financially to support a forensic interviewer being here. And that's essentially the person who's really talking to these young children and their families and helping them in the healing process and helping them solve this issue and get the legal assistance that they need to really move forward with their lives. So we have that piece of it. But the other piece is really, being involved in reporting. And so we've really got two levels in two ways people can give to this program. And so important to our region and to the welfare and the safety of our children. And, I think about children, and who doesn't care about a child being safe? We worry about them on the playground. We worry about them running across the road and crossing the street. We have a tremendous responsibility to create a healthy future for these young people. Any last thoughts, things you want to share?
I think that sort of the last thought is these poor kids deserve to be heard. Not only heard, but believed. So when they are heard from and they're believed, that is the first step towards healing. And if the abuse is reported early enough and when they're young enough, that gives us and the child the best chance to truly heal. If the abuse goes on for years or is suppressed for years, it's a much more difficult situation to really address. So it's early intervention, trusting that these kids need to be heard and believed. That's what's going to lead to the healing process.
I do want to ask you one last thing, Phil, before I close out the show. And And that's really around the long-term support for folks going through this, because it's not a one and done. It's not an interview process, and what I'm hearing is there's a wraparound of service to these young people and their families that is longer term and is really getting them through the process of that healing. And that could be years that takes. So it sounds like the support is there, and we know that there is a safety net of services. And I want to remind our public of that we have a wealth of services, and you are working with them. So that seems like an important message too, that this isn't just about the interview process and prosecuting and getting them on the healing path. It's supporting them throughout that process for the long
That's right,
term.
and the term wraparound is appropriate for sure. We have a very rigorous case review process, and the multidisciplinary team, again, prosecution, law enforcement, child victims advocates, Monadnock Center for Violence Prevention, MFS, and DCYF, meets on a monthly basis to review cases and to ensure that they are progressing not only in terms of a law enforcement function, but also in terms of a human service function. So it's a process that gets this team together so that there are wraparound services that the family actually desperately needs. I mean, this is a tough healing process for sure.
And it's a long-term healing process.
It's long-term.
And I definitely know that from working with young people who've experienced this.
And it's also great, frankly, to be part of the Monadnock United Way family, because many of these services are provided by Monadnock United Way partner agencies.
And it really does allow people to connect through that process. So incredible work going on out there with the Granite State Children's Alliance. And I really want to highlight for you, audience, that you hear Granite State Children's Alliance, and it is a statewide initiative, but we are fortunate to have right here in the Monadnock region a child advocacy center available to our families, to our children who are experiencing abuse. And you, as citizens, have an opportunity to become part of making sure this doesn't happen on an ongoing basis to somebody that you may know. I encourage you to be proactive, to get involved where you need to get involved, to be a responsible citizen here in the Monadnock region. And I thank you for your giving, your advocating, and your volunteering that you do out there. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week.
Great.